The man who single-handedly rewrote what a rap album is supposed to sound like. The man who has a Pulitzer Prize sitting in his house next to 5 Grammy-caliber projects is now being told by internet commentators that his next album is the most important of his entire career. Not important, the most important. And I need you to sit with that sentence for a second, because what is being sold to you right now, dressed up as praise, is actually one of the most disrespectful takes I have seen dropped on Kendrick Lamar in the last 5 years, and nobody is calling it what it is. The Mallory brothers just released a video where they laid this whole theory out, that because Drake dropped and because J. Cole dropped and because the internet is louder than it has ever been, Kendrick Lamar now has to answer, now has to prove something, now has to walk into the studio with the pressure of the entire genre on his shoulders like he has not already been carrying it for over a decade. And the wildest part is that they said it with a straight face, while also saying, quote, he does not have to prove anything, in the same breath. That is not a take. That is a contradiction wearing a jersey. And what everyone is missing, what nobody has connected yet, is that this exact conversation, the most important album conversation, is the same conversation that was being had 6 months ago, and the same conversation that was being had before GNX dropped, and the same conversation that will be had after the next one drops, because it is not actually about the album at all. It is about a narrative machine that has decided Kendrick Lamar is the one artist in this genre who has to keep re-earning a spot he has already permanently claimed, while everybody else gets to coast on numbers and nostalgia. And when we get to the part of this video where I break down why the last Kendrick album already answered every question people are pretending to still be asking, and I promise you we are getting there, you are going to see why this entire conversation was built on a foundation that collapsed the second Luther sat at #1 for 13 straight weeks. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe. Let's get into it. So let me set the table properly, because I want everybody watching to be fully oriented before we start dismantling this piece by piece. The situation is this. Kendrick Lamar Duckworth, the Compton rapper who has been on top of the critical hip-hop conversation since roughly 2012, is coming off arguably the most dominant 24-month run any artist in this genre has had in the modern streaming era. He won a very public battle against Drake, one of the most commercially successful artists in the history of recorded music. He dropped Not Like Us, which became a cultural phenomenon that transcended rap and turned into a stadium-sized anthem played at every function, every wedding reception, every sporting event, every barbecue on the continent. He then followed that up by surprise releasing GNX with no rollout, no announcement, no vinyl, no CDs, no pre-orders, no press cycle, nothing. And it still debuted at #1 and produced Luther, which spent 13 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 before Billboard essentially changed the rules and forced it out of the top slot. He then followed that up by headlining the Super Bowl halftime show, which became the most watched halftime performance in television history. He then followed that up with the Grand National Tour, one of the highest grossing hip-hop tours ever assembled. And now, after all of that, after arguably the most dominant career-defining stretch any rapper has had in the last 15 years, a video circulates on the internet arguing that his next album is the most important of his career, because Drake and Cole put out albums and, quote, put respect back on their names. That's the setup. That's the story on the surface. But the reason we are here today is because that surface reading is not just wrong, it is structurally, culturally, and industrially wrong in a way that reveals something much deeper about how the conversation around this artist is being manufactured. And the stakes here are not small. Musically, the stakes are that we are about to enter a cycle where every project Kendrick releases from now until the end of his career is going to be framed as a referendum on whether he still deserves the position he already earned. Culturally, the stakes are that we are watching in real time the birth of a new phase in hip-hop discourse, where the winner of a beef is subjected to more scrutiny than the loser, which is completely backwards. Financially, the stakes are that the entire commentary economy, podcasts, YouTube channels, blogs, gossip pages, has figured out that Kendrick engagement pays, and the easiest way to farm that engagement is to constantly reopen a case that has already been closed. And reputation-wise, the stakes are that if we let this conversation harden into consensus, 20 years from now, people will look back and genuinely believe Kendrick had to fight for his legacy against the field, when the truth is the field has been fighting to catch up to him for over a decade. So the question we are actually asking today is not whether Kendrick's next album will be important. The question is why we are being told it has to be, and who benefits from that framing. Let's get into the surface evidence, because before we go anywhere near the industry layer of this, I need everybody to see with their own eyes what has been publicly documented. Because when you actually lay out the facts, the most important album theory falls apart in about 45 seconds. Piece of evidence number 1. GNX, the album that supposedly did not take listeners on a journey, the album some people are trying to retroactively downgrade, debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 with over 300,000 album equivalent units in its first week. And I want you to remember this, with no rollout, no promotion, no announcement, no single push, no interviews, no press, no teaser campaign, no vinyl, no CDs, no pre-sale, no pre-order, no nothing. It dropped on a random Friday afternoon in late 2024 with a music video for a song that was not even on the album, and the album was already number 1 before most fans had even finished processing that it existed. That is not the trajectory of an artist who needs to prove anything. That is the trajectory of an artist who is operating on a level the industry has not seen since the peak commercial runs of the early 2000s. Piece of evidence number 2. Luther, the Kendrick and SZA collaboration from GNX, sat at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 13 consecutive weeks. 13. That is not a fluke. That is not a viral moment. That is not a TikTok accident. That is a song dominating the singles chart for a full quarter of a calendar year, in a streaming era where nothing stays anywhere for very long. And the only reason it eventually came down was because Billboard restructured how they counted certain streams, which conveniently affected the song that was blocking everyone else at the top. If Luther is not the definitive answer to the question, does Kendrick still have commercial pull, I do not know what possibly could be. And yet, the same commentators who are now framing the next album as a proving ground are the same ones who somehow developed collective amnesia about the fact that this happened less than a year ago. Piece of evidence number 3, the Super Bowl halftime show. Kendrick Lamar performed at the biggest single-night entertainment event in the United States and turned it into a coordinated, high-concept, politically charged, visually cinematic statement that had every major publication writing think pieces for the next 2 weeks. According to publicly reported viewership numbers, it became the most-watched halftime performance in Super Bowl history. He also performed Not Like Us on national television at the Super Bowl in front of the largest audience possible, and it became a cultural moment that people still reference nearly a year later. Does that sound like an artist whose next album needs to answer scrutiny, or does that sound like an artist who has already been operating in a category no one else in the current field can even access? Piece of evidence number 4, the Grand National Tour. Reportedly one of the highest-grossing hip-hop tours in recent memory, sold out across multiple markets, extended dates, co-headlined with SZA, and generated the kind of live market revenue that most artists in this genre spend their entire careers chasing. And this happened right after the album, right after the Super Bowl, right after the beef, right after the singles chart dominance. It was not a comeback, it was a coronation, and it happened while the same commentators who are now questioning what he has to prove were on their podcasts arguing about whether the beef was really over. So when I hear anyone say the next album is the most important of his career, I have to ask, most important compared to what exactly? Because the last 2 years already delivered the kind of dominance most careers never reach. And oh, do I have more. Because the surface evidence is just the appetizer. The real meal is what people close to the situation have been saying, doing, and posting. And I promise you, the Kendrick skeptics online are really not going to like this next stretch. Because when you actually look at the cultural response, not the loudest tweets, not the algorithmically amplified hate accounts, not the professionally aggrieved commentary class, but the actual reaction from artists, from industry veterans, from culture bearers who have been in this game longer than most of us have been alive, the picture flips completely. And there is one specific reaction I want to break down when we get to it that essentially settles the entire argument about where Kendrick stands in the room right now. So stay with me.
Let's move into the cultural evidence layer. Piece number 1 on this layer, the artist response. Look at who has been publicly aligning themselves with Kendrick over the last 2 years. Look at the features he has been placed on. Look at the fact that DJ Dahi's upcoming album reportedly has a Kendrick feature that industry insiders who claim to have heard it are describing as, quote, something completely different than anybody would expect. That kind of language does not come out of nowhere. When people in the studio ecosystem, people around producers, people around the artists themselves are describing an upcoming feature as boundary pushing, that tells you where Kendrick's creative head is at right now, and it is not in a defensive posture. It is in an offensive one. Artists who need to prove themselves do not disappear and then resurface with jazz-inflected experimental features. Artists who are already comfortable at the top of the mountain do that. Piece number 2, the peer silence. And this one is subtle, but you have to pay attention to it. Notice which artists have gone completely quiet about Kendrick since the beef ended. Notice which former critics, which former subliminal shooters, which former he is overrated tweeters have simply stopped saying his name. Notice how the same names that used to pop up every few months with some kind of shot at Kendrick have gone underground. That silence is louder than any diss track. That silence tells you that the artists who actually understand the game know that the water is hotter than it has ever been, and jumping into it right now is a career-ending decision. And when Lupe Fiasco recently tried to reopen the "I am a better lyricist than Kendrick" argument that has been circulating for years, the response was not a debate. The response was widespread agreement that it was not really a conversation worth having, which is itself a kind of cultural verdict. Piece number 3. The new fan phenomenon. And this is one that the loudest voices in the hate corner refuse to acknowledge because it destroys their entire premise. Over the last 2 to 3 years, Kendrick Lamar has acquired an entirely new generation of fans, people who had stopped listening to hip-hop, people who were more casually engaged with the genre, people who came in through the Super Bowl performance, or through Not Like Us going stadium nuclear, or through the cultural moment of the beef itself, and then went backward through the catalog and discovered Good Kid, Mod City, and To Pimp a Butterfly, and Damn, and Mr. Morale in the Big Steppers. Good Kid, Mod City has been on the Billboard 200 for over 500 weeks. 500! Since 2012. That is not a stagnant catalog. That is a living, breathing, ever-growing base of listeners who did not exist a year ago and who are now waiting on the next drop with the same energy the Day One fans have carried for a decade. Any theory of Most Important Album that ignores the fact that Kendrick's audience is bigger, younger, and more culturally engaged than at any prior point in his career is a theory that does not survive contact with reality. Piece number 4. The industry validation. And this is where I want to bring in a nuance and then dismantle it, because I want everyone watching to feel like they are getting the full picture and not just the emotional response. Here is the counterargument, stated as fairly as I can state it. Someone could reasonably say, Kendrick has not put out a lyrically dense, narrative-driven concept album journey since Mr. Morale, and GNX, while commercially dominant, was structured more like a victory lap than a statement piece. So the argument goes, the Most Important Album theory is really just saying he needs to return to the concept album mode to reaffirm his artistic ceiling. Fine, that is a real position. Here is why it still collapses. First, GNX was never trying to be a concept album. It was designed as a post-beef celebration project, and judging it against To Pimp a Butterfly is like judging a Jordan Finals clinching game against a Jordan 63-point playoff loss to the Celtics. They are different projects with different purposes. Second, the assumption that Kendrick owes anyone a return to that mode presupposes that he has an obligation to a specific kind of listener rather than to his own creative arc. And third, and most importantly, we have literally zero information about what the next album sounds like. There is no leak, no snippet, no title, no rollout, no direction. Everyone declaring it the most important album is doing so with zero evidence about what it actually is, which means the framing is entirely narrative, not artistic. That's the tell. When people are grading an album before it exists, they are not really talking about the album. They are talking about the story they want to tell about the artist. And that story is where we need to shift now.
because the deeper we go, the uglier the machinery gets. Because here is what I want everybody to really lock into for the next several minutes. What we are actually watching is not a music conversation. It is a business conversation dressed up as a music conversation. And once you see the shape of it, you cannot unsee it. Let me walk you through the 3 layers of the system that are producing this narrative, because when you understand the structure, you understand why this most important album framing keeps resurrecting itself no matter how many times Kendrick answers it. Layer 1 of the system, the commentary economy. YouTube, podcasts, blogs, and social media pages have collectively figured out over the last 2 years that Kendrick engagement is the most reliably lucrative content in hip-hop right now. His name and a title is a click. His face and a thumbnail is a click. A take about his career trajectory is a click. And because the algorithm rewards volume and controversy, the incentive structure pushes every commentator toward one of 2 positions, either extreme praise or extreme skepticism, with no middle ground. And here is the thing, extreme praise gets old fast. There is only so many times you can say a man is a genius before the audience tunes out. But extreme skepticism, or in the case of the most important album framing, disguised skepticism, praise that is actually a demand for continued performance, that has infinite regenerative potential. You can reset the will he deliver narrative every single album cycle, forever. And that is exactly what is happening. This framing is not an insight. It is a content strategy. And once you see it as a content strategy, the contradiction the Mallory brothers made, saying the album is his most important, while also saying he does not have to prove anything, makes complete sense, because the framing was never meant to be internally consistent. It was meant to be engagement bait. And engagement bait does not need to make logical sense. It only needs to make people click and comment and stitch and do it. Layer 2 of the system, the streaming and label ecosystem. This is where it gets more sinister, and I want everybody to pay very close attention. The modern label game, and I'm talking about how the majors operate right now in 2026, is structured around narrative continuity. What that means is that the labels do not just want albums, they want ongoing stories that generate promotional cycles, that generate streaming revenue, that generates back catalog revitalization. Every time Kendrick's next album is framed as pivotal, that framing benefits every album he has ever put out because it drives listeners back through the catalog to prepare. Good Kid streams go up, To Pimp a Butterfly streams go up, Damn streams go up, GNX streams go up. The most important album narrative is, in a very real economic sense, a rising tide that lifts every asset on the balance sheet. So even when Kendrick himself is doing nothing, saying nothing, promoting nothing, the ecosystem around him is monetizing the anticipation. And that ecosystem includes not just his label, but the platforms, the media outlets, the commentary channels, and the algorithmic distribution systems that decide what you see. Everyone is incentivized to keep the "what will he do next" question alive, because the question itself is the product. The album is almost secondary. Layer 3 of the system, and this is the deepest layer, so track with me. The manufactured parody problem. What has happened over the last 12 months is that the industry, the media, and the commentary class have collectively decided that they need to restore the illusion of a big 3 in rap. Drake put out an album that by his commercial standards was a return to the top of the charts, even if the music itself was widely considered underwhelming by critics and fans. J. Cole put out a project that his base rallied around. And now, in order to complete the triangle, the narrative machine needs Kendrick to be positioned as still in competition, because the big 3 framing only works if all 3 artists are treated as roughly equivalent, still fighting for the same crown, still needing to prove themselves against one another. But here is the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Kendrick left that framing behind roughly 2 years ago, when Not Like Us went stadium anthem nuclear, when Luther sat at #1 for a quarter of a year, when the Super Bowl halftime happened, when the Grand National Tour grossed what it grossed. The big 3 ceased to be a real thing and became a marketing construct. But marketing constructs are profitable, so the industry has to keep pretending it exists. And the way you keep pretending it exists
exists is by framing every Kendrick release as a competitive checkpoint against Drake and Cole, rather than what it actually is, an artist operating in his own tier, releasing music on his own timeline. That is the manufactured parody problem. That is why the most important album theory keeps getting recycled. The theory is not designed to describe reality. It is designed to sustain a commercial fiction. And now we get to the reveal, because everything I have just walked you through leads to one specific conclusion. And this is the conclusion that the loudest voices in the commentary class are structurally incapable of saying, because saying it would end their content pipeline overnight. Here is the reveal. The narrative that Kendrick Lamar's next album is the most important of his career is not a music critical position. It is not a fan position. It is not an artist respecting position. It is a business-motivated framing designed to keep him permanently in a state of narrative competition with peers he has already, by every measurable metric, surpassed in this current cycle. And the reason this framing keeps being deployed by commentators, even ones who genuinely mean well, even ones who consider themselves Kendrick fans, is because the framing has become so embedded in how hip-hop discourse operates that people repeat it without realizing they are participating in a system that materially benefits from Kendrick being permanently unsettled in the public conversation. This is what I want everybody to sit with. When someone tells you that the artist who just dropped a #1 album with no rollout, whose lead single sat at #1 for 13 weeks, who headlined the most-watched halftime show in history, and who just completed one of the highest-grossing tours in the genre, when someone tells you that artist needs to prove himself on the next album, they are not making a music argument. They are participating wittingly or unwittingly in a machinery that has decided this artist's peace of mind and creative freedom are less valuable than the ongoing content cycle his uncertainty generates. That is the reveal. That is the thing nobody is saying. And once you see every most important album video, every he has to answer the doubters tweet, every the pressure is on Kendrick now podcast segment reads completely differently. It reads as what it actually is, which is the sound of a system trying to keep a man who already won from being allowed to enjoy the winning. And the man is going to release the album he wants to release, on the timeline he wants to release it.
The mode he wants to release it, because he has already earned every ounce of that freedom. And when he does, the same commentators who are calling it the most important album of his career will pivot within 24 hours to calling the album after that the most important. Because the framing does not care about the answer. The framing only cares that the question keeps getting asked. So where does that leave the hero of this story? It leaves him exactly where he has been for the last 2 years, rising, working, unbothered, and operating on a level the current field cannot access without inflating themselves through narrative manipulation. Kendrick Lamar does not need to prove anything to anyone on his next album. He does not need to prove anything to the Mallory brothers. He does not need to prove anything to Twitter. He does not need to prove anything to Lupe Fiasco or to the fringe hate accounts or to the commentary economy that has decided his uncertainty is profitable. The evidence I walked you through in this video is the answer to every question anyone has pretended to ask. The GNX rollout, the Luther chart run, the Super Bowl performance, the Grand National Tour, the catalog longevity, the new fan influx, the peer silence, the industry validation, all of it together forms a picture of an artist who is not in a proving stage. He is in a legacy consolidation stage. He is in the stage of a career where the projects are no longer about answering doubters, because the doubters have been eliminated by the results. Any doubt that still exists is manufactured, farmed, or performed for engagement. And when the next album drops, whether it is a return to conceptual density like To Pimp a Butterfly, or a jazz-inflected experiment like the DJ Dahi feature suggests he might be exploring, or a completely unexpected pivot into a mode we have not heard from him before, the album will not be his most important. It will be his next. And that word, next, is the entire point. This is an artist who gets to have a next. This is an artist who has been so consistent, so undefeated in the ways that actually matter, that every release is simply the next data point in a career that has already been decided in his favor. One artist is being told he has to keep proving himself. The other one is just quietly stacking wins without even being outside.
Guess which one is Kendrick? The hero of this story is fine. The hero of this story has been fine. The hero of this story is going to continue to be fine because the evidence has already spoken and the record is already carved into the concrete. And the more the commentary class tries to reopen the case, the more they reveal that the case is closed and they simply cannot make peace with the verdict. But this is only the start, because if you think this most important album framing is going to die down before the next Kendrick release, you have not been paying attention to how this cycle works. Between now and whenever the next album actually drops, we are going to see at least two very specific developments that are already visible on the horizon. The first is the DJ Dahi album, which reportedly contains that Kendrick feature that early listeners are describing as boundary pushing. And depending on when that project lands, we are about to see the entire "what direction is Kendrick going in" conversation kick into overdrive based on a single feature verse. Mark that. That is coming. The second development is that as we get closer to the next album cycle, you are going to see the commentary economy escalate the most important album framing into something even more aggressive. Expect think pieces, expect podcast episodes, expect video essays, expect an entire industry of speculation content built on top of an album that does not exist yet. And I am going to be here breaking every single piece of it down as it happens, because somebody has to. Somebody has to keep the receipts. Somebody has to call the framing what it is when it shows up wearing a costume. That is what this channel does. That is what we do here. So make sure you are subscribed, make sure notifications are on, and make sure you are locked in for the next few months, because the ride is only accelerating from here. And on the next one, I want to break down something even bigger. The specific reason Drake's recent commercial performance has been quietly propped up by mechanisms that most listeners have not been told about, and how the numbers you are being shown are not the numbers that actually matter. There is a gap between the streaming figures being reported and the organic listening behavior underneath them, and once you see how that gap has been engineered, you are going to understand why the Big Three framing is more of a life support system for one specific artist than it is a real competitive tier. That video is coming next, and trust me, you do not want to miss it. Peace.